Cool. So let's see. First of all, thanks everyone so much for taking the time to be in this one today. Of course, give me 1 second. And let me see if I can share my screen and get us started. All right. So everything good? Everybody can see?
Yes.
I'll take that.
Yep.
Yes. Sweet. So my name is Eric Toupin. I have worked with Aten Design Group. I'm a senior developer there. Been there for more than 15 years. Also the lead developer for 2 projects I'm going to talk about today, Solo and SSF. That's Stanford on and off campus learning opportunities and Stanford seed funding. I have been leading those projects from the technical side with the READY team. That's Stanford's Research, Information Technology, and Innovation for about 7 years, since 2015. So today what I'm going to talk about is Drupal 7 to Backdrop CMS upgrades, specifically for complicated applications, and a little bit about what those are, like what I mean by complicated, and then how we approach it from estimation and execution. The reason this might be interesting to some folks is because when we approached these projects, it was myself and Joel Steidel, the director of engineering at Aten Design Group, that actually did the bulk of the work. Joel had 0 Backdrop experience, and I had like piddling, like just been introduced to Backdrop. And so this might be useful for folks who don't have a lot of Backdrop experience, but would like to tackle some larger projects. Okay, so I threw a slide in here with the disclaimer on it. And basically all I mean by this is that this is purely experience sharing. I would certainly not call this a prescriptive approach as much as here's what we did. It went pretty well for us, and hopefully that's useful for somebody. So the things that I'm planning on talking through today, first, what do we mean by a complex application? And I'll talk a little bit about Solo and SSF and try to qualify what we mean by that. And then specifically how we came to choose Backdrop CMS. And again, I think this is interesting because, well, I wouldn't say Aten Design Group is a Drupal shop. We do tons of Drupal work. We do, I think it's easy to say primarily Drupal work. And these websites that started as Drupal 7, our traditional move would have been to go to Drupal 9. And so I do think it's a little interesting how we came about to the decision of moving to Backdrop CMS. And then talking a little bit about why you would upgrade to Backdrop instead of rebuilding to Drupal 9 or in some other platform. Probably a lot of folks are familiar with that, so I'm not going to spend much time there. And then some information about estimation and execution. This is going to be extremely high level, not diving into the specifics of execution stuff, just talking about general strategies. So this is Stanford on and off campus learning opportunities. You can visit this website at solo.stanford.edu. And this one is Stanford seed funding. You can visit this one at seedfunding.stanford.edu. These are the sites that myself and Joel Steidel converted from Drupal 7 to Backdrop CMS end of last year. So if you visit those sites, solo.stanford.edu and seedfunding.stanford.edu, you can click around, you can see some opportunities and about page, but you can't really see much if you're not an authenticated user, and you can't really authenticate unless you're Stanford. So what I'd like to do is just show some slides of the back end and talk a little bit about some of the features of these websites to really qualify what we mean by complicated. The screens that we're going to walk through will show a user called a program officer that would be creating an opportunity and an application form to apply for that opportunity, a custom application form, and then collecting applications and managing those applications and eventually trying to award some folks the opportunity. An opportunity on this website, the Stanford on and off campus learning opportunities website, would be an educational opportunity. So go work at a hospital in China, go work in a manufacturing plant in Taiwan, or go intern somewhere, like learn about whatever it is that you're studying, as well as other like educational experiences besides internships. The other site, seed funding, would be more about faculty members looking for research funding. And so these would be opportunities to have your research funded, and they would be applying for funding. But we're going to stick with just talking about solo today, just because there's not much time for both of these. So I'm going to turn this on autoplay real quick and just go through some of these slides while I talk about some of these features. Okay, so this should just kind of run. I think the most important takeaway is that we started these projects in 2015, and they have been under active development since. And so every month or 2 months at the longest, except for the break to upgrade the site, we have been releasing brand new features to our audiences. They're still under active development. I released new features this week on Wednesday to both sites. So we've been building these for quite a long time. These two websites facilitate complex application management workflows that were developed specifically for Stanford faculty, staff, and students. They're highly customized. We use more than 60 contrib modules, more than 30 custom modules that we wrote. We have 2 custom API integrations. One is Stanford profiles that brings over faculty information, faculty professional profiles like research interests, title department, and attaches those automatically to applications. And we have an integration with MAIS, which is middleware and integration services, that brings over student records, your major, your minor, GPA, and attaches those automatically to your applications. These use SSO for sign-in. They use Stanford's SUNET system, which also brings over some metadata, which is useful for us to identify users as students, faculty, staff, whatever. Both of these sites perform complex on-the-fly PDF rendering. So what we mean there is just that as program officers collect dozens or hundreds of applications, and there's, they create these custom forms. There's 10 different form or field types you can use in those forms. And as folks fill those out, you can then download those as kind of on-the-fly rendered PDFs. And you can use an automated download manager to package those. So you have, you download 10 at a time and send them off to one reviewer, or 20 and send them to another. Both of these sites use 5 distinct user roles. There's actually a little more, but the major user roles are program officers who create the opportunities, applicants who apply to them, reviewers, so you can create custom review rubrics to tell people how to score your applications, and then invite people to review them and score them. Student program officers can recruit students to help them with management tasks. Recommenders who would like upload recommendation letters or other assets to recommend applicants. And all of those have unique experiences and unique permission sets, et cetera. We also have a customizable notification system. We send a couple of dozen different notifications in designed emails and in dashboard notifications on the actual platform, saying things like, you started an application, you didn't finish it, your application's due in a week, your application is under review, you've been awarded, this person started an application on your opportunity, tons of stuff that just kind of pushes people along the workflows. I'm going to pause this real quick, the slideshow. Yeah. We have more than 18,000 Stanford users on these sites, and we have advertised more than 1,000 opportunities since the beginning of the projects back in 2015, which represents tons of student experiences, educational experiences, and also incredible amounts of research funding. Monthly, we receive as many as 20,000 visits on these and serve as many as around 275,000 pages. Okay, so the reason that I walked through that whole thing is really just to talk about what we were tackling here in terms of an upgrade. And really the focus there is years and years, 7 years of development, active user base. And what do you do in a case like that when all of a sudden Drupal 7 is at risk of end of lifing? So now I'm going to talk a little bit about why we chose Backdrop. As I mentioned before, we do tons of Drupal work, and definitely our kind of go-to plan would have been upgrading to Drupal 9. And it's one of the first things we started talking about. there's a couple of interesting factors here. One is that on the Stanford side, the Reedy team, the director of that team is Zach Chandler. And Zach was familiar with Backdrop and familiar with some of the folks involved with Backdrop. And so right from the beginning, and he's also a tech savvy guy and knew what we'd been building and knew that rebuilding in Drupal 9 was going to be a huge, huge project. And so right from the beginning, he just kind of threw out the idea like, hey, why don't we look into Backdrop and see if that's something we could do? And he thought maybe we could save, 80% of the cost of the project. And so his reaction to that was, let's talk about it as a team. Let's figure out if this is something that we can actually do, something that's viable. So then it came to me to kind of do that investigation part and see if it's viable. And actually, I had been, like I said earlier, kind of piddling around with Backdrop for a couple of months. I built some personal sites in it, helped a friend build a small site with it, mostly because I was interested myself in what I was going to do with Drupal 7 sites. And also just because I'm really comfortable in a lot of the existing Drupal 7 APIs that I've been building in for so long. Also, for me, I really do love coding and spend much of my day every day coding. Really enjoy that part of my job, but also really more than anything, programming is a means to an end. I like to deliver value to clients. I like clients to be excited about where we're going with technology. And so for me, saving that 7 years of coding work seemed, of course, like an excellent opportunity. Another thing here is that we had over the years begun building tests. Back then they were in Selenium, now they're in Cypress, to cover a lot of these features because it's a real small team. So it's a 5-person team in total, managing this product with thousands of users. And over the years, it's really hard to keep track of all those features. And so we have these tests, we have thousands of tests that run and they cover 80% of the features that we've developed. But I have a daily experience in our stand-up meetings and in our sprint planning of realizing that we've built something and forgotten about it, that somebody has like a bug complaint. And I'm like, wow, I haven't seen that feature in like 2 years. And with that experience, it worries me quite a bit to rebuild a platform completely in Drupal 9, because anything that you don't have documented or you don't have really clear context on how it's working could really easily slip through the cracks. And that was really worrisome for me. Okay, so then a little bit of why you would upgrade to Backdrop instead of rebuilding in a different platform or in the newest version of Drupal. And I think some of this stuff is pretty obvious to everyone here. Maybe not, but I did do a couple of talks on this previously, specifically about why upgrading to Backdrop CMS is a really good idea versus Drupal in some cases. If you Google Aten webinar Backdrop, you can find my talk on that if you are not yet convinced. And I go over a lot of the specifics in that one. But on this one, I'm just gonna like extremely high level summarize what kind of our decision-making process was there. So the first thing is that the cost is dramatically different. We estimated between 4,500 and 5,000 hours to rebuild these platforms in Drupal 9. And I think that was a really, optimistic estimation, at least in my opinion. When we actually finished the project in Backdrop, there was a lot of risk going in because we didn't know what we were getting into. But at the end of it, we ended up spending 550 hours to complete everything. And so you can see that the cost difference is just absolutely huge. Another thing is lower risk. I mentioned this a second ago, but when you upgrade to Backdrop, you don't lose your code base and you don't lose your content. You don't lose your data structures. So normally with a rebuild, you'd have to migrate your users, migrate your nodes, migrate terms, reestablish all of those data structures, the connections between all of those. And with an upgrade to Backdrop, you don't have to do that. And so a lot of those structures are preserved. You have that kind of extra security. And specifically the code base thing. So like I mentioned before, anything that you had built or fixed or adjusted that you forget about is gone when you rebuild. Whereas if you upgrade, it's still there and it may be working already. And if not, it may need like a little touch up and it's working. So then timeline's pretty obvious if you think about cost. But timeline here is going to be extremely shorter compared to the timeline for a rebuild. We were able to use far few developers and far less time than we would have used for a full rebuild. And then some ongoing costs, and this one doesn't apply if you're thinking about upgrading somebody else's site that you didn't build. But if it's your own site, if you've been building in Drupal 7 or your team's been building in Drupal 7, and then you upgrade to Backdrop, all of the infrastructure that you built is there. And any helper functions, anything that you built is kind of put together for you. I see that there's some stuff in the chat here, and I'm just going to answer those at the end of this. I'll get to those as soon as we get through this, and hopefully we can figure some of that stuff out. What did I do? There we go. Yeah, so if you're building in a code base that you've been working in Drupal 7 and you upgrade, basically all of the things that you have built for yourself, all the little helpers that you've built for yourself and your approaches are still there. And so what we would call, velocity and kind of the agile speak of the more you work on your code, the faster you work on your code, that stuff survives. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about estimation. And I want to kind of forewarning here that this is a little bit of like black magic, as estimation often is, at least to me. One big thing here is the estimation is extremely unique per project, right? And so this is going to change quite a bit from one website to another, or from one application to another. There's some knowns, and I think that's where we start, but there's also tons of unknowns. And that's true in your own code base if you've been building it for years, and it's doubly true in somebody else's code base that you're now taking on. I wouldn't quite say it's a shot in the dark to estimate on projects, but it's extremely, extremely difficult to get an accurate number, a precise number. And the difficulty is that you can say those things to clients. You can say that it's really difficult, and you can say that this is a number we're going to shoot for, but you can't not give them a number. You have to give somebody a number to get started on, or a range of numbers anyways. I think it probably goes without saying, but the more time that you spend looking at code and thinking about what it's going to take to convert it, the more precise your estimation is. But that's an interesting dynamic, because if you're bidding on a project, you can't look at the code for 2 weeks, because that's time lost. You're not getting paid for that time. And even if you aren't bidding on a project, even if it's a current client that you're in a high confidence relationship with, and they're like, hey, I'm really interested in learning more about Backdrop. Can you estimate that for me? It might even in that case be a hard sell to say, yeah, give me 2 weeks, or yeah, give me a week of billable time, And so it becomes difficult to figure out, like, how do you get a reasonably good idea with a low investment of time? Okay, so I mentioned a second ago, there are lots of unknowns, but there are also plenty of knowns. And I think the really obvious knowns are contrib modules, custom modules, and theme. And then I'd go beyond that, and I'll spend a little more time on these in a second. But also testing. Testing is extremely important. And we'll talk more about that in a second, actually. And then also time for dry runs. So at some point, you're going to need to deploy the site, and we need to practice that. And again, I'll return to that in a second. So for these first couple of things, for contrib modules specifically, there's a module called Backdrop Upgrade Status that is provided primarily by the Backdrop folks. And this is, you want to use this, right? This gives you an absolutely easy overview of what your work is going to be. So you install this module, the Backdrop Upgrade Status module, on your Drupal 7 site. And this is a local copy of my of one of these sites, actually, the old Drupal 7 version that I'm looking at. I can't actually click any links because I think my virtual machine is no longer running. But so if you install this module and you click check the status of my site, real easy interface, and it goes through a little progress bar, and then it spits out this screen. And this screen shows you, okay, admin views is now in core. And auth cache, that's not yet available. And automatic node tiles, yeah, that's a module, that's available. Bean, that's in core. So you've got all this useful information about what you need to do with your contrib modules. So if you start with something like this, and then we moved all that information into this extremely messy spreadsheet, which I'm a tiny bit embarrassed to share, but you can see that we have this module column, and we throw all of our modules in there. And then we move over some of the information that we get from this backdrop upgrade status. I will mention that even if something says not yet available in backdrop, I would go ahead and just Google Backdrop CMS name of module. You might find there's a repo out there of somebody working on it, something unofficial, which is a great starting point, right? So then we have all of these modules, and we have their status. You're going to want to ignore most of these columns, at least for now. But basically, this column is, does it exist in Backdrop? And you can see, yeah, there's plenty in core, got lots of project pages. And then we get down a little bit farther, and we get a couple that aren't. Now, this is a copy of a spreadsheet that we actually used last year. So it may very well be outdated. If you see any module in here that now exists, don't get hung up on that. This is kind of an old spreadsheet. But you can see that we have a bunch like encrypt or collectomy or fences, role reference, SendGrid that do not yet exist in Backdrop. So what we did to try to get a sense for the size of the work ahead of us, this will be a bit of a rabbit trail, but on the Solo and SSF project, we use story points to estimate almost everything. The story points is like this agile practice thing. I'm not sure how familiar people are with that. I certainly wasn't until we started this project, although that's been several years now. But the idea is that you don't estimate in hours, you estimate in level of effort or complexity. And you use an arbitrary system called points. And lots of different shops do this different ways, but the way that we do it for this particular project is we stick to the Fibonacci sequence for the series of complexities, right? So it's 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, et cetera. And I think what that's supposed to portray is the more complex something gets, the more you don't know how complicated it is. And so it really gets like real complicated real fast. And an easy way to think about this, an easy way that I think about this anyways, is like playing chess. If you're playing chess with somebody and you study the board, it becomes pretty obvious what your next move is. And so it's pretty easy. That one's pretty easy to guess. But if you want to guess like 2 moves in advance, what's your next move going to be? Well, a lot of variables are introduced, and you become real uncertain about what your next move might be. And 3 moves ahead, like maybe chess masters think 3 moves ahead. I certainly can't. And so I think that's what we're kind of talking about, is as those numbers get higher, it's getting orders of complexity further down the road. Okay, so what we did is Joel, who at this time had never touched Backdrop, was going to do our first module conversion. And we chose SendGrid because we needed the module, and we thought that it was going to be pretty complex to convert, just kind of picking it out of the crowd. So Joel assumed from the beginning that was going to be a level 5 in complexity, which for us, and with our the way that we've historically used points on this project, represents an extremely complex task, like up to a week of work or something. But then he got into it and saw that like, oh, actually, okay, Backdrop is pretty familiar and things are pretty easy to do. He finished the SendGrid integration conversion, at least to a standard that was working for all of our needs. And then looking back on it in retrospect, you can see over here in the complexity column, he was like, actually in retrospect, that's closer to like a 3, which for us would be like a day to a couple of days. So then he had a little Backdrop experience. I had a little Backdrop experience. We went through each one of these contrib modules, and we just kind of browsed through the code. We looked at includes, and we tried to get a general sense of like, what do we think this is going to be? Is it a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 5? And we marked every one of these that needed to be converted with a number. This was a process of hours. This was not a very long process. So we spent, maybe 5 to 30 minutes in a module, each module kind of going down and just assigning it a number, trying to get a sense of complexity. Okay, so then if we go down to the bottom of this column, and again, this is not like really a presentable spreadsheet. But if we go down here and add all of this up, you can see that all of our complexity points add up to 54 points. And then we can also see that SendGrid, we called it a complexity of 3. And it took Joel about a day and a half to get things all working and all in place. And so we round that up a little bit. We call it 12 hours. and we get 3 points is 12 hours, which means 1 point is 4 hours. We do a little bit of math, and we come out with 216 hours for converting all these contrib modules. So then you can see, in our parentheses back on these slides that we have kind of hours estimates next to everything. And that's how we came to the contrib modules estimate. I'm absolutely aware that this is a little bit of black magic. And I think that the goal is again, not to be precise, but to try to efficiently get to a number that that's in the right ballpark. So then we look at custom modules. And I think that if you were upgrading a site that's not yours, I would use a similar process. So now we've bid on a couple of other Backdrop conversion sites. And this is the process that I use, but with their custom modules as well. In my case, I had written the majority of the custom modules for this platform. And so I felt pretty confident that I could spend just a couple of hours in each and be done in about 2 weeks. So then we come to the theme. And with the theme, we used a really similar process. So Joel did the first theme conversion here. And all we did is we picked one page, an opportunity page from that seed funding site, and said, okay, what's it going to take to get one opportunity page to look right on Backdrop? And we're not talking about backend here. So when we look at like the node template, everywhere where it says print title or print content, we're taking all that stuff out and just putting in like, typing in content. We just want to see if the template looks right. And getting that template to look right for an opportunity page just took a couple of hours for Joel. And so he looked at the rest of the theme and said, I think I can do this in about a week. So we have 40 hours there. I think the most important part of this is that we do the work. We do a few hours of the work in every category. So we convert a contrib module. We have already done the custom modules, and we convert some templates in order to get an idea. Because if, being brand new to Backdrop, if you don't have any experience, you want to make it, it's still a little bit of a shot in the dark, but you want to lower the risk there. And so real important to actually touch the code and get a sense for the process. Okay, so then testing, we had a large suite of Selenium tests that we had built, and we ended up during this project actually converting them to Cypress, but that wasn't the plan from the beginning. And the thing that those Selenium tests gave us was a really great framework for testing. Some things had to change because the markup changed between Drupal and Backdrop. And so the tests that we use do target specific markup structures. But because we had all those tests already in place, getting them to run on the new platform and then actually running through them was not extremely time intensive. And so that was about a week as well. And our original estimates were about a week, and it actually did come through at about a week. If you don't have tests built for a platform, and even if it's yours and you built the platform from the ground up, but definitely if it's somebody else's, I would say that it's indispensable to do side-by-side testing where you have the Drupal 7 site open in one browser and your Backdrop site open in another browser, and you just go through every single user experience that you can and make sure that things look as identical as possible. Okay, and then the last thing that I'll mention here is time for dry runs. So this process took us 3 months. It was actually 10 weeks because we took some vacation in December, but it took about 10 weeks. And the culmination of all of your work is that you have your Backdrop project ready, and then you drop in your Drupal 7 database, and you should be able to just run the upgrade process like through the point and click interface. The reality for us, at least, was that there was a few other steps. We had to disable this module that was throwing errors until we get this module to work, and then enable it again, et cetera. So there's some practice that we had to go through to get that point and click process to really work the way we wanted it to. And for us, we needed to move from Drupal 7 to Backdrop in a matter of hours. We were going to have 4 hours to move these projects from live on Drupal 7 to live on Backdrop at some point. And so for me, practicing these dry ones was extremely important. And if you're in a similar position where you need to deploy quickly at the end of this, do the practice and just feel really confident with that so that you don't feel too under the gun when the time comes to do it quick. Okay, so all these numbers together, you do a little math here, and we come up with a total of 416 hours. I mentioned earlier, we actually took 550 hours. That's a little bit bigger than 416. We did some other stuff in there that's not Backdrop related. We decided to move to Pantheon. We had to do some code changes there. Like I mentioned earlier, we converted Selenium tests to Cypress tests. So there was some other work kind of in that larger bucket. But we came in the right ballpark, right? And if I had to do it again, even though I felt like those were pretty generous numbers to begin with, if I had to do it again, I'd pad more generously. I'd add another 30% onto this whole process. I would say if you're estimating, pad as much as you feel comfortable presenting to your client. And hopefully that gets somewhere around 30%. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about the actual execution, what it looked like to convert these platforms. Again, this is going to be super high level. Like I said before, it was about a 10-week process, and I'm certainly not going to go through step by step there. First thing, real important, is again coming back to this Backdrop upgrade status module. This again gives you a great list. It just sets your work out in front of you. Obviously, this doesn't include the theme, but in terms of backend upgrade process, it just tells you what you're going to have to do. We moved all that stuff into a spreadsheet that I already mentioned, and then we tracked our own progress in our own columns, like, hey, how's it on our side? Is it spot checked? Is it reviewed? We just did some simple stuff in a spreadsheet like this, real simple spreadsheet to track our own progress. Okay, so then also Coder Upgrade is a module that you'll absolutely want to use. So there's a lot of API changes between Drupal and Backdrop that are formulaic, like find this, replace it with that. And Coder Upgrade knows all of those and does it all for you. And so really, I mean, I feel like you would just be wasting your time not to use Coder Upgrade, like definitely use it. For many modules, it simply does the work for you when you're done for simpler modules. And for everything else, it gets you to a place where you can start doing real troubleshooting and not piddling around with the little details. So what we did, and I'm interested in feedback on this, but what we did was we set up a Backdrop sandbox site, just a fresh install. And then we selected the modules that we needed to convert that had the fewest dependencies, no dependencies, or had already built or upgraded their dependencies. And we moved them in to this fresh install site and tried to install them, you know, after we did the basic upgrade with Coder Upgrade or whatever. And then there's some errors. In some of them there weren't, but in many there's some errors when you try to install them. So then you go look up those errors and try to figure out what's going on. You fix them. Once you actually get it to install effectively, then you try to go to the config screens and see if those are working. And if there's no errors, that's awesome. And if there are, you start debugging again and figure it out until you aren't throwing errors. Once you're not throwing errors on the config screens or the install screen, then start looking at the actual feature, like, you know, role reference. Did it create a role reference field? Can I make that as a field type? And if you see errors or if it's not working, it's time to debug again. Otherwise, you could be good to go. The other 2 weeks ago, I converted web form HTML field from Drupal 7 to Backdrop for the same project actually. And it took, I mean, less than 3 minutes. It was absolutely nothing. It was changing the info file and changing like one place where it said Drupal and should have said Backdrop. So some of these can be incredibly fast. Also, I spent like I don't know, I want to say a week on Encrypt. Encrypt was really confusing me working on this project back in last year. So it really varies quite a bit. There's a lot of gambling in there. So once you get your modules working in your kind of vanilla site and your fresh install, and then you keep adding in your contrib modules as you get them working, adding them in. And once you have your whole list working, then we move that into our converted code base for Backdrop and try to spin it up with the database and see what happens. If you do convert your modules and you are interested in making them community ready, you can absolutely use Coder Review to try to help get things back up to standard after your kind of potentially messy upgrade process. Theme conversion, there's some pretty easy to follow theme converting docs. This stuff laid it out for us pretty easily. We did not, I mentioned this before in previous talks, we didn't take full advantage of the layout system, and I want to. That's something that I'm hoping to do later this year for these platforms. But originally, our goal was just to get our templates working. And the information in these documents definitely helps you get there pretty quickly. Okay, and then I'll just mention real briefly a few of the things that were kind of big things to overcome for me at the time. We did this stuff last year. I've since been working with Backdrop a lot more. But in retrospect, context was a big one that I didn't plan on. If your Drupal 7 site makes extensive use of context, just know that that's complexity. So if you look at a Drupal 7 site and you're estimating on upgrading it, and they've got a bunch of context in there, you're going to have to figure out what you want to do with that. Are you going to do that in layouts? Are you going to write something custom? There's some decisions to be made. The way libraries is included, or are included rather, has changed, and that confused me a couple of different times. And so if you're looking at modules, you're thinking about estimating an upgrade, and they're including libraries, things like, whether it's JavaScript or PHP libraries, we used like MPDF library, for example, simple SAML, like a bunch of stuff. And that was a little confusing as well. So I would say add some complexity, add some estimation for that. Class extensions with another one that kind of caught me off guard is any modules in Drupal 7, Contrib or custom or whatever, that are extending classes or that are extending some like native Drupal classes, I would pay special attention there. Some of those classes, their attributes and methods have changed a little bit. And so that can also be kind of a big thing, like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I have to rewrite these class extensions for this module. And then one final little gotcha was user roles. Basically, role ID in the user's roles table has changed. And that's a real small thing. It's not that big a deal to fix. But if you're doing a lot of evaluating user roles and making decisions on experience or permissions based on that, that's definitely something to pay attention to, and pretty fixable with like a find and replace, but it's nice to look out for. And then finally, the way this actually looked, it was a 10-week process. And I think I spent about 6 weeks of it just on my couch, this couch, pouring through code, just looking at Xdebug and trying to figure out what's going on and trying to get it working. And that may sound tedious to a lot of developers. I really enjoyed it. I've found that it gave me quite a bit more context on how things actually work and on how things interact with core. And it was, of course, really irritating at times, but also just gave me a lot more kind of breadth of understanding of how the platform we built, the hooks we built, kind of interacted with the rest of the code. So I would say, yeah, plan on doing a lot of debugging. The short of it for the outcome of these projects, they're doing great. We're building new features. They've been on Backdrop since January. The client is absolutely thrilled. So, as much of a success as it can be, it is. I don't want to talk too much about that. And then let me try to see, that's the end of what I got. So I'm going to see what's in the chat and see if there's anything I can add some more light on here. Actually, I'll switch you over to this here. Also, if you do think of any questions, comments, if you're interested in talking more about this stuff, I love talking about it. My email is real easy. It's eric@aten.io. So feel free to shoot me an email anytime. I'm going to read through some of the stuff in the chat real quick. Okay, so the first thing was details about the 4,500 hour estimate. And okay, so this is going to be hard to talk about clearly, but
well, you talked about it some shortly after I wrote that. So I mean, cool. I felt it was kind of answered just by your presentation.
Thanks for saying that. I think the estimation that we use for Backdrop is similar to something we use for Drupal 9. One of the biggest differences is that with Backdrop, we were planning on keeping the same theme, right? Like everything was going to be exactly the same. And in Drupal 9, we would be switching to the Drupal 9 theming system. And that would almost by default, at least in our agency, include a whole nother department, which is the information architecture, user experience, and design departments of Aten Design Group. And so by default, it becomes a much larger project because we would start with things like design discovery and design comps and rethinking the whole design aspect. And that's mostly because the front end is just engineered totally different in Drupal 9 than it is in Backdrop. But other than that, extremely similar process. We're just going through modules and going through features, and myself and Joel and a few other developers kind of brainstorming about what we think it's going to take to build it. Views block exposed filter block is on the list. Coder upgrade ports it. Oh, interesting. I don't have any additional context on that. The list is a little bit old. That's from last year sometime. But whatever's on there is now working. So I should take a look and see if there's a version that maybe we wrote that we should replace. That seems about, let's see. That seems about it. Any questions? Any other thoughts, or anybody have anything else they want to talk about?
I have a question. Anybody from your team will be at Denver Drupal Camp?
Almost certainly. We're headquartered in Denver, and so I imagine a lot of people will be there.
Thinking. I plan to be there, and I hope to connect with folks on migrations to Backdrop as well.
Awesome. That would be great.
Yeah.
I bet Joe will be there.
Okay, because I pinged him in Slack and he didn't respond. So I'm like, I pinged Joe Crespo and Joel, and none of them. I'm like, I wonder if they're there or not, because we're also building a bunch of things with Backdrop, and it's a great opportunity to collaborate.
Yeah, absolutely. I also wanted to call out, Ryan said another pitfall is C-tools. Thanks for pointing that out. I didn't put that in my list, and that's just my own, I forgot to. Absolutely, that was a pain. Using anything that uses C-tools plugins was another thing that was just like, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? But absolutely solvable, and still solvable in a much smaller timeline than rebuilding, obviously.
Yeah, definitely pad your schedule if you've discovered C-tool stuff, even if it's as basic as modal windows, because oh man, the documentation on it is spare, and it's not it's not easy. I will say that.
I totally agree. I often feel like I forget things right after I learn them, like how C-tools works. Like I spend a week staring at code, and finally I'm like, aha. And then 3 weeks later, I'm like, oh man, I'm gonna have to learn that again next time. Cool. Well, if there's nothing else, any other questions? Yeah.
I have a quick question. In the recording that you did for the Drupal Camp Asheville, which I watched, you mentioned that a lot of the modules that you ported were preliminary ports, as in they were for your purposes only, and that they weren't kind of ready. Are there any that you sort of feel that could be made contrib candidates?
Yes, there are. I know that SendGrid and Simple SAML PHP are usable. I know that role reference, at least our version, is usable, although someone may have done that again since we did. I have a usable version of Encrypt, but man, is it not, I mean, it's ready for somebody else to work on. It's not really ready for the community. If you want to send me an email, I can get you a list, and I can also get you a list of the links to all the stuff we do have on GitHub. Cool. Anything else? Great.
Yeah.
Well, hey, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Would it be possible to have a look at the encrypt module? Because it is something that I'm interested in, with something that I want to do. Obviously, encrypt data, if that makes sense. And I'd just like to say thank you for the presentation. Absolutely fantastic. It's really helped me, being a small sort of one-man band, so to speak, seeing other people's workflow and how they do things, and it's surprisingly similar to how I work as well. So it's absolutely really good to know that other people are working in a similar vein. So thank you. Yeah,
thanks for saying that. I really appreciate it. And I feel the same. I feel like if somebody had told me before, yeah, I've done this, it's doable, it took me 10 weeks. Like if I just had the confidence of somebody else saying that I've done it, it's doable, that's really helpful sometimes at the beginning. And yeah, absolutely. I can share what I have so far with Encrypt. And again, if you just want to shoot me an email so I have your contact, I can do it that way. Great. Cool. I'm going to assume that's it. Thanks so much, everybody, for taking the time. And if you do have any questions or want to poke at me for anything, eric@aten.io. And thanks again. Y'all have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.